preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Laura Kaminsky, Associate Director of Education, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the 92nd Street Y for the second night of our series produced in cooperation with the new criterion, Directions in the Arts. Regarding tonight's format, each guest will make a brief introductory statement about the future of the American Art Museum, after which they will join moderator Hugh Southern for conversation of the issues raised by their preliminary remarks. During the course of that conversation, you may write your questions on the index cards you received upon entering the hall. The ushers will come down the aisles throughout the evening, collect your cards, and bring them backstage for presentation. Our guests this evening are Hilton Kramer and Henry Hopkins. Henry Hopkins, who will speak first, is the director of the Frederick R. Weissman Collection in Los Angeles, a position he has held since 1986. Before that, he served as director of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. He's often served as a panelist at the National Endowment for the Arts and was chairman of its museum policy panel from 1979 to 1983. An artist of some renown, Mr. Hopkins' work was frequently shown in the early 1950s, but he then turned to academic pursuits and completed coursework for the doctorate degree in 20th century art history at the University of California in Los Angeles. Mr. Hopkins has written and lectured extensively on modern and contemporary art. He is also known as an avid fly fisherman and nature enthusiast, two pursuits which may or may not be relevant to tonight's discussion. Hilton Kramer is a frequent lecturer at the 92nd Street Y, and we are delighted that he is back here with us this season. He's spoken here in the previous two seasons on different issues relating to contemporary art and quality of life in society, etc. Since 1982, Mr. Kramer has held the position of editor of the New Criterion, prior to which he served as chief art critic of the New York Times, where he had worked since 1965 in a variety of positions. He's the author of The Age of the Avant-Garde and The Revenge of the Philistines, Art and Culture, 1972 to 1984. His latest work is The Abstract Art, A Cultural History. It's a pleasure also to welcome back our series moderator, Hugh Southern, the Deputy Chairman for Programs at the National Endowment for the Arts. At the NEA, he is responsible for supervising the 12 major arts disciplines programs of the agency. And prior to that appointment, Mr. Southern served as Executive Director of the Theater Development Fund for 14 years. He is a trustee of the Actors Fund of America and serves on the adjunct faculty of Columbia University's School of the Arts Graduate Arts Administration program. We are honored that these three gentlemen are here with us tonight to debate the future of the American Art Museum. Please join me in welcoming them. Thank you.
So that you recognize this, Henry Hopkins on the right, Hilton Kramer in the middle, and Hugh Southern on the left.
We all look very much the same to me, Hugh. I don't Well, when I was asked to speak at the 92nd Street Y, being essentially a person who has worked most of his professional life in the West, I was not entirely sure what I was getting into, but I have been assured through time that this is one of the liveliest forums for musical, social, and art activity in the city of New York, and has a deserved reputation for bringing people together of like and different attitudes. I have no idea tonight whether my attitudes differ from those of Hilton Kramer's, but we will find out, I suppose, as we go along. I would like to begin my short beginning statement by simply saying that art museums, as we know them at the present time in America, especially museums of modern and contemporary art, are in a very precarious position, not only in terms of finance, where a less desirable tax-giving structure and an unsettled economy certainly will have negative effects in the near future, but also in terms of collection development and exhibition policy, which is, after all, independent of finances, the heart of an institution. To illustrate that position, I would like to talk a little bit of how we got into this less than desirable condition. I would like to talk about the condition itself, and I would like to, throughout the evening sometime, suggest some possible solutions. This will require just a little bit of history, which actually I think will save Hilton a bit of time later on, since we are both of the same, not only the same generation, but exactly the same age, coming into the world at the same time 59 years ago. So we must have at least like attitudes about certain attitudes in the art world. For me, the Industrial Revolution at the end of the last century, the beginning of this one, marked the first meaningful change in our art attitudes. When it was possible to cross the ocean in 6 or 7 days, when the railways could whip you from New York to San Francisco in 4 days, and when the telegram and the continental cable put us in daily touch with Europe, we began to emerge, not only as a nation, but as an artistic community. Some Americans actually studied to be artists and learned in Paris, Rome, and Dusseldorf. They became aware of European treatment of art as an abstract idea rather than a depictor of things as had been our heritage since our inception. The Great Armory Show of 1913, developed by a group of American artists, brought the best of European modernism to these shores. Cubism, Fauvism, and Futurism became new words in the American art vocabulary, and even though most of what was offered was rejected by the American people and the American press, a few hardy souls, George O'Keeffe, John Marin, Arthur Dove, Charles Sheeler, and Marsden Hartley, goaded by Alfred Stieglitz, reached out to establish a timid American modernism where the idea was as important as the image. But there was no market for these concepts, and we are a nation that judges success in the marketplace. Undoubtedly, the single most important factor in the change of American attitudes about art and culture was the institution of the GI Bill as it developed after World War II. World War II was a watershed in many ways, but most importantly, to my mind, it marked the final transition of America from being an isolationist, agrarian society to becoming an international, urban society. And nobody understood this better than the millions of young men and women who played the primary role in this holocaustic activity. The single burning issue before them upon their return was simply, how do we prevent this from happening again? Importantly, the side effects of the war, even on this idealistic group, were not all negative. Millions of Americans had first-hand contact with exotic Asian and European cultures. Millions of Americans had visited cathedrals, shrines, museums, and residences, where they began to better understand their position as part of a world society. So when they came trooping home to a free 4-year college education, they chose to expand upon that awareness. Enrollment in Pacific courses of study, literature, language, history, art, theater, and dance began to soar. What a change the war and the GI Bill brought about. We would never be quite the same. What happened in the visual arts? Specifically, thousands trained to be artists, thousands trained to be art educators, thousands more trained to be art historians with the idea of university teaching or museum work in mind. The only difficulty that there were not that many jobs in the arts, so a whole new structure had to be developed. In 1950, whatever American art world there was in New York. A few great museums were scattered around the country. A few wealthy collectors gathered the works of European Impressionists, Post-Impressionists, Fauves, and Cubists, but there was no American gallery scene to speak of. You could buy the best of American art, a George O'Keeffe or a Sheeler or even a Jackson Pollock for a few $100s, but no one wanted it. The Museum of Modern Art in New York was key among the few institutions organizing exhibitions of modern art to travel to the rest of the country and indeed the world through their international program. The thousands of newly trained young people could not all work at the Museum of Modern Art, though they would have loved to. So they took whatever job they could find. Wherever they could find it, they began to proselytize and to educate. Within a decade, public schools were offering art courses at the elementary and secondary school levels. Small colleges taught art appreciation as a matter of course. Larger universities established full curriculums in art history. Cities of over 100,000 population began to develop art centers, which later turned into museums. Many of these bright young people became dealers in strange places like Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston, and developed a market. Thousands more, of course, produced the art that fueled this activity. Museums in Minneapolis, Buffalo, San Francisco, Chicago, and Los Angeles became daring after their adolescence and began to originate exhibitions which challenged in philosophical and intellectual content the best that was being offered in New York. Over time, these exhibitions were even written about by professional art critics rather than the newspaper's social editor or off-duty crime reporter. American artists became international heroes, and even European museums could not feel complete without owning a Pollock, Rothko, or de Kooning. Very heady stuff indeed, and continuing to this moment, with an expansion of museum facilities, a dramatic increase in numbers of dealers and collectors, every new auction records record prices, and even during national economic recession. I was referring at this point to the recession of 1974, not the coming one of 1988. Art had become so important to American life that the sale of a painting of sunflowers by Vincent van Gogh for nearly $40 million, now superseded by the $53 million sale, was capable of demanding front-page coverage, even amidst Irangate, the perils of Jim and Tammy Baker, and the peccadillos of Gary Hart. Unfortunately, we are now at a point in this little discussion when idealism must give way to reality. Just at the moment, about a decade ago, when everything was going beautifully, a number of clever, entrepreneurial money men moved into the art world, and the me now generation began to prevail. As art became acceptable, and then desirable, and then almost mandatory as a symbol of success, replacing automobiles, furs, and jewelry, the art market began to rise. Record prices were paid at auction for everything from Chinese snuff bottles to Andy Warhol soup cans. Investment in art could be shown to outstrip investment in precious metals and the stock market. Brilliant, self-made entrepreneurs entered the art scene, both to invest and to surround themselves with trappings of success. The market continues to rise as new wealth positioned itself in a competitive mode. The issue became winning, paying a higher price than your business partner, gaining the reputation in the art world as a high roller. The concept of art as a humanizing mechanism gave way to the idea of art as an icon, a symbol. Works of art became rich men's baseball cards, and to them had as much significance. Actual waiting lists to buy emerged for hot artists, such as Frank Stella and Richard Diebenkorn. Diebenkorn prices, which were $12,000 for an Ocean Park painting, moved to $16,000, $30,000, $50,000, $90,000, $150,000, and now $350,000 in a span of 15 years. For living artists such as Jasper Johns and Willem de Kooning, for works of art to sell over $1 million is now commonplace. Several artists now in their late 30s and early 40s sell regularly for over $100,000 apiece. We as art professionals failed to respond to what was happening since we were so pleased that art was being accepted. That was our idealism of our generation, and to know that some artists were actually making a living as good as a doctor or a not so good lawyer or even a baseball player. The truth of the matter is that no one benefits from this frenzied market except the dealer, and perhaps those investment collectors who will bail out at the right time. Specifically, what has happened is that American art museums, and again I will emphasize I'm talking primarily about modern and contemporary institutions, are increasingly controlled by entrepreneurial trustees who have little nonprofit experience and who are more concerned with the bottom line than they are with the museum's program of acquisition, exhibition, and conservation. These men were brought into museum boards primarily because of their new wealth and their seeming capacity to help the institution in its fundraising efforts, which on surface was probably okay, but unfortunately they were also new collectors. By new collectors, I mean collectors who came to the idea of collecting for social and possible monetary gain rather than love of the art or the object. These entrepreneurs have been groomed by art dealers, not art history classes, and endless museum visitations. Because their art interest is pragmatic rather than idealistic, they see an increase in the monetary value of the work of art as the single sign of the work's importance. And true to their entrepreneurial spirit, they work hard to achieve this end. They tout others on a given artist at higher prices than they paid. They sit on accession and exhibition committees of museums where they propose acquisitions and exhibitions of the artists they have purchased to establish the artist's reputations. Ultimately, when the price is right, they will offer the work to the museum as a tax write-off gift, which you can be sure is rarely refused. The problem beyond the obvious is that they all collect the same things, and the result in many American museums looks so much alike that it's getting boring. Another point, museums which deal with contemporary art simply cannot continue to collect and exhibit with the abandon of the past decades. There's not enough room in any major urban center to allow for the physical expansion which would be required to house these results of these collections. Right now, right here in Manhattan, a visit to the Frank Stella and Julian Schnabel exhibitions should give proof to this point. If we suspend belief for a moment and pretend that Stella and Schnabel are the two dominant art figures of the 60s and the 1980s, as Roberta Smith suggested in her New York Times article on December 6th, if a decision is made to collect either one of these artists in the depth that Matisse or Picasso has been collected by MoMA, it would require a space, an exhibition space larger than the entire Renaissance collection or the 19th century collection at the Met. Even worse, that the collecting should be done and the work not exhibited, at least on a regular basis. Can you imagine for the museum staffs of this nation the constant up and downs of those works, the conservation, and the distressing fact that it is now almost as expensive to store a work of art as it is to exhibit it? MoMA is probably the classic case of a museum which has reached its physical limitations. Even with the Pele expansion, which allowed breathing room for the already existing permanent collection, there is simply no more room for contemporary collection expansion, and the temporary exhibition galleries are inadequate to maintain an ongoing and stimulating contemporary program. What was once an institution bursting with energy and excitement has matured into a beautiful jewel. Like a fly caught in amber, its best hope for the future is to present the permanent collection and leave thoughts of contemporaneity to someone else. But in New York, who else? The Whitney, Guggenheim, and now the Met are fast approaching similar status of Manhattan gridlock. Is Brooklyn the wave of the future? I'm going to stop my initial presentation now with those thoughts. I'd like to talk more about exhibitions and other things, but Hilton, it's your turn. All right.
Well, I find myself this evening in the unaccustomed position of being sort of outclassed by a pessimist beyond even my powers.
I thought that might throw you.
But of course, Henry has served in the trenches, whereas I've just been, as it were, a visiting correspondent. He's seen the blood and gore, whereas I've only come in afterwards to assess the official damages. In this question, as in most cultural questions today, it is, as Henry suggests, always worse than we think. I want to approach this subject from a slightly different and, although I suppose no less autobiographical perspective, and talk a little bit about the changes that have overtaken the art museum in America in my own lifetime, because I think these changes not only portend what the future of the American Art Museum is going to be, but give us a fairly fixed notion of the only fate we can expect it to pursue unless some radical intervention takes place. I'm tempted, because of the accidents of my own experience, to begin by making a comparison between the sort of two principal areas of professional life that I've been involved with, namely newspaper journalism and the art world. And I think there is a reasonable basis for suggesting that the kinds of changes that, say, have taken place in the New York Times, to speak of my alma mater, as it were, in the last 15 or 20 years or so, are in many ways exactly comparable to the changes that have taken place in the American Art Museum. That is, if you think of the primary function of a newspaper like the Times as being to publish news, and the primary function of an art museum is to show you the greatest art, then we all know that tremendous modifications in the sense of this function have taken place within living memory. That is, you know, we're all addicted to reading the Times, and we hardly notice, part of the time anyway, that most of what we read in the paper has absolutely nothing to do with the news. I mean, it's tremendously absorbing and entertaining and amusing. I was struck yesterday by the article on the food page of the Times Magazine, which was devoted to a kind of rebellion against trendy food. And it reminded me of a story which I have a horrible feeling I have told from this platform once before, of a meeting that I once attended with my editors at the New York Times. It was a weekly meeting, and every week the meeting began with the same question, which was, what's new? And on one of these occasions, I made the mistake of saying, well, there was nothing new. And the question came back from my editor, well, is that a trend? And yesterday, this, you know, haunted me when the whole article in the Times food magazine food department was the rebellion against trendy food. But it's true that what has happened to journalism is an exact analog as what has happened to art in the art museum. That is, it has sort of disappeared under cover of things that act as a kind of simulacrum. And many of the things that have come into the American Art Museum and that, alas, seem to forecast the future configuration of museum programs really have very little to do with the actualities of artistic experience. And I suspect that we will have occasion this evening to talk more about that. There, I think, is no question that the greatest change that has overtaken the American Art Museum in our lifetime, and that is clearly going to kind of prefiguration of what is in store for us in the next decade or two, is the change in sizes and numbers. That is, the tremendous expansion of facilities, the tremendous increase in the sheer number of museums, the tremendous enlargement of public attendance, the urge to make everything larger, to accommodate more people, to bring in more money, more objects, occupy more space, more programs, and have access to more people who will pay more admission fees, buy more objects in the gift shop, buy more memberships, bring in their friends, perhaps bring in their the corporations that they're associated with as sponsors, and so on and so on. That is, the notion of the museum as a kind of infinitely expandable cultural and social institution. This has, I think, not accidentally been accompanied by a radical shift in focus, say over the last 40 years in American art museums, from a primary concern with the past, with the old masters, to a fairly sustained concentration on contemporary art and the culture of the present. That is a shift that has been not only a shift in historical, in the kind of historical venue of the art museum, but a more, in my opinion, momentous shift from a focus on permanence, that is, a focus on what is of permanent interest in art, to a focus on currency, that is, of what is of temporary interest in art. Then there is that very large and difficult question of the altered character of the museum itself as a cultural institution. That is, the introduction of movie programs. I mean, in my generation, we could remember, I can remember when the only museum where you went to see movies was the Museum of Modern Art, because there were very few other places in which you could see some of the really great old films. There were always, you know, people who went to see the annual showing of Greta Garbo and Camille, but they were considered special and not especially interested in art. But then when it turned out that even MoMA began having Samuel Goldwyn festivals, we knew that the whole thing had turned a corner, because art was no longer the question. The whole altered character of the museum as a cultural institution, with its movie programs, video programs, its, quote, educational, unquote, programs, the museum as a place in which to go shopping, museum as a place in which to attend a concert, have lunch, give a cocktail party, arrange a corporate dinner. That all sort of turned the museum in another direction, and the role of art, the role of the museum actually functioning as an agency of aesthetic experience, somehow was shifted to the margin of institutional purpose, and no longer seemed to have make a primary demand on either the attention of the board or of the museum staff. And then, not incidentally, I suppose in my own professional lifetime, the single department of museums that has expanded in authority and often too in numbers to the greatest degree has been the public relations staff. I mean, I can remember in those long ago innocent days of the 1950s, now much maligned, when at the Museum of Modern Art, which was even then regarded as something rather special, there was in the public relations office Elizabeth Shaw and her secretary, and that was it. And Liz Shaw was able to answer every question. I mean, it's true, there weren't many people asking the question. But the other thing that was remarkable about it was that she actually knew what was going on. And she could actually look at a picture and know what it was, and so on. The whole realm of public relations, or what is now called public information, which is, of course, as we all know, public disinformation, of museums, has really become an incredible industry wielding far greater authority, not only in the eyes of the public, but in the eyes of the board of trustees than the curatorial staff. And this has totally altered the dynamics of the museum as a cultural institution. And then there, of course, is the whole role, a new role, let's say, since the 60s. It was one of the things that the 60s bequeathed to us. The new role of the museum as a venue for corporate promotional activities. Now, we're all, we've all learned to be tremendously grateful for all these corporations that fund large and wonderful exhibitions, and we tend, or at least you tend, not I, not to ask questions about what they expect in return. They expect a lot. And it turns out that corporate sponsorship of major art exhibitions is a rather cheap investment for the big corporations. Just the other day, and of course they do put a lot of money into it, but it's not a lot of money in terms of, their budgets. Just the other day, I went to a lunch that was occasioned by an art event, an art museum event, that gave me a peculiar insight into what corporate sponsorship of art in 1987, 88 consists of. That is, there is going to be a huge, and I'm sure marvelous, Gauguin retrospective next year, organized jointly by the National Gallery in Washington, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the French National Museums in Paris. And it's not coming up for a while, but it's on its way. And as a kind of preliminary announcement for this event, there was a lunch held in New York last week, sponsored by the corporate sponsor of this exhibition, AT&T. And it was held at a modest little place called Le Cercle. I didn't count the number of people who were present. There were too many tables for that. I suppose I'm not an investigative reporter, so I haven't actually established what it cost per person, but I would guess it was somewhere in the neighborhood of $100. And they were wonderful about flying in Françoise, my old friend Françoise Cachin, the director of the Musée d'Orsay from Paris. I'm sure she didn't go coach. And there's no reason why she should. I mean, it would be beyond being bad at mathematics. It would be beyond my capacity to calculate what AT&T spent on this lunch. There were, by the way, very few people from the New York press there, but there were a lot of museum professionals, AT&T professionals, public relations professionals, and I have to say the food and the two wines are absolutely marvelous. But this is what it is now means for corporations to be patrons of the arts. We sort of go back to those food pages in the New York Times again. It's almost inseparable. Then there is, particularly in talking about the future of the American Art Museum, for me, the most momentous change that has taken place in my lifetime in the American Art Museum. And that is the programmatic and now almost runaway effort to transform the Art Museum from what it had formerly been conceived to be as a temple of high art to what it is now being promoted and urged into being, which is a palace of popular culture. We are given a kind of preview of this in the Metropolitan Museum's new tapes, again sponsored by the ubiquitous AT&T. I suppose it's all part of the price we're expected to pay for the breakup of the telephone company. These AT&T tapes in which we're invited to go on a tour of historical paintings with Walter Cronkite. Now, nobody in his right mind would want to listen to Walter Cronkite talking about painting. Or Beverly Sills, or there's also a comedian, that is a professional comedian involved. So what does it mean for the Metropolitan Museum to really cheat the public into believing that they, if they pay $20 for these tapes, that they can actually learn something about art, because it's a fraud. And everybody at the Metropolitan Museum knows it's a fraud. And it's a humiliation for the curatorial staff that this takes place. And they are suffering, the professional staff, by the vulgarization and the corruption of their function. What does it mean? It means that the museum has made a decision to attempt, no matter what the cultural cost, in bringing in more and more people, trying to persuade more and more people that there's a way of their being interested in something that they're really not prepared in any way to be interested in. How then does this impulse, this momentum to transform the American Art Museum from a temple of high art into a palace of popular culture affect its programs? Well, it affects programs differently in different institutions in different parts of the country at different rates of speed, but it's happening all over. In the museum I've often felt closest to, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which I first went to, I suppose, about the age of 14, and have always had a great affectionate attachment to. Of course, it was wonderful in those days because you never saw another person when you went there, not even a guard. They have just announced their new big exhibition for the coming year, which is devoted to Hollywood and fashion. Now, this is a deeply shocking development to me. The museum has a fine new director in Alan Shestak, a scholar who I believe wrote his doctoral dissertation on medieval engravings. This is a shocking development. But they, no doubt the museum took a leaf out of the history of the Metropolitan Museum, which since they came under the sway of Diana Vreeland, has put on a great many costume events. And there is absolutely no question that these events bring in a public that is new to the museum and will never come back for anything else. The museum is constantly now under pressure to change, to be something other than an art museum, to be something other than an institution that upholds a certain aesthetic standard. And this has also, one of the pressures that has also contributed to this transformation is a kind of naked political pressure that is not art world politics only, but real politics. Years ago, I coined a term in writing about one of these developments in the New York Times, in which I talked about the era of the détente exhibitions compared to what's happening tonight. Of course, that was the Age of Innocence. But we had the exhibitions from the Soviet Union and from China and from Egypt and God knows where. All determined not by artistic considerations. Some of the exhibitions were marvelous, some of them were poor, but it had absolutely nothing to do with the quality of the exhibitions so far as the museums were concerned. It had to do with political considerations and with the fact that the political objectives were such that the government would arrange, or interested parties would arrange, for these exhibitions to be economical and guaranteed successes for the institutions. We're going to get a lot more of them. And some of them will be fine, and some of them will not be so fine. Then there's the other kind of political exhibition, which now museums are under tremendous pressure to encompass. That is, the women's exhibitions and the exhibitions devoted to ethnic minorities, or what we might generally call exhibitions of segregated art. Exhibitions that museums, which were created ostensibly to uphold a certain aesthetic standard, have agreed to show that on the basis of non-aesthetic standards. That is a precedent that every museum that has ever agreed to this policy will live to regret. Then there are, of course, the straight-out political exhibitions, Judy Chicago, Hans Hacker, and so on, that have absolutely no aesthetic merit, but have been brought into the museums because they have a political audience, they have a political constituency, they have a political point, and aesthetics form absolutely no part of the consideration. That, too, will become something that will haunt those institutions, and they will live to regret it. Not because the public will call them to account, but because they will not be able to ever refuse anything on the basis of artistic standards once they have surrendered to these political criteria. And then finally, there is the what you might call the all-encompassing horror that awaits us in the future that we see very much at work in the present, all of which is designed to accommodate all of the worst developments I have been describing, and that is the mania for expansion. Here in New York, we've just seen the Metropolitan Museum add 22 galleries for the showing of contemporary art without having any contemporary art to show in them. The Whitney, the Guggenheim, the Brooklyn Museum, all clamoring for permission and funds to build, 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 build. When not one of these museums has demonstrated that they have the staff, the vision, the mentality, the taste, the standards to adequately make the best use of the space they already occupy. The art museum is a kind of runaway institution at the moment. It is hurling through space, undirected by intelligence, in the service of a great many commercial, ideological, social, political impulses that almost nobody in the mainstream media wants to pay serious attention to, but which we are all, as taxpayers and as part of the cultural community, expected in the future to support and to face the consequences of. It is not a pretty picture. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure which brand of pessimism we choose. I do want to encourage both of our speakers to pick up on this discussion, but I wanted to serve them up a question myself first, which is, both of you have reflected quite a bit on, so to speak, the extravagant manifestations of these trends or tendencies in museums like the Museum of Modern Art or the Metropolitan Museum, but there are, of course, a very large number of museums in this country. And are you simply suggesting that these major institutions in the larger cities are portents of the future throughout the field, or isn't there some counterbalance in perhaps more tranquil, less within the focus of the media places where quite a bit of useful, serious, and undistorted work is being done?
May I respond to that? Yeah, there's several things that could be said, and I think that I don't brand my own view necessarily pessimistic. I view it as realistic, and it's quite true that we did spend most of our time talking about a particular set of institutions, which are the familiar institutions because of their flamboyance over the past decades. I think if I can make an analogy, while I was working on this talk today, I was listening fragmentedly to what was going on in the market, the world stock market, on your Channel 10, I think it is, which runs all of these things. But it was making the point over and over and over again that the only time that the market will begin to bounce back is when things get so awful and everybody throws up their hands and says this is the end of that something new can indeed begin to emerge. And I think that's what we're hoping for in the context of what we talked about. But yes, there are those institutions, the Morgan Library among them, right here in the city. I think of the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth. I think of the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth. And essentially what I'm naming are institutions which have their own income base, almost independent of corporate sponsorship or even NEA support, which have boards of trustees that essentially are family boards, which either make them disinterested or deeply interested, and small. By that I mean 4 or 5 members as opposed to 60 or 70 that would make up a board at the Whitney or the San Francisco Museum at the present time. And yes, they are counterbalancing in terms of presenting exhibitions that have high content value and publications that have high content value. The difficulty, unfortunately, as I think Hilton will agree, they are in large part in sections of the country which are rarely reviewed by institutions such as the New York Times. And exhibitions can occur there and go unheralded, and one will find a catalog 6 months later on a remainder shelf and say, gee, that was really something that I missed, and feel very badly about in context. I would like to talk a little bit, just make one observation in relation to what Hilton was saying. We're talking about the massive increase of what we call public relations and public information. The only exception I would take with his point there is simply that I feel that the other department that has grown equally quickly is the Department of Development in every institution. And certainly neither of those have much to do with the content of the museum. The other thing I would like to make, since it ran through my head 3 or 4 times when you were speaking, was about when did this change occur? When did this change to the flamboyant, up to the moment, taste-making situation occur? And in my recollection, it was in the, I guess it would be the 1950s, when William Seitz was the curator at the Museum of Modern Art here. And he developed an exhibition called The Responsive Eye, which dealt with that art which took the retina of your eye and bounced it back and forth off the wall, Vasarely and others of that ilk. And between the time that he announced the exhibition and the time that it occurred, some 500 to 800 other artists had become responsive eye artists in the process, so that as he traveled from the east to the west and around the world, selecting artists, suddenly there were new ones here, new ones there, new ones everywhere. And by the time the show was up, the charge, perhaps from you, Hilton, was tastemaking. And that, in my mind, was the first major exhibition where a curator was running the line so close to the production of art that he was indeed setting a standard, and then schools were emerging around his attitudes rather than the art emerging in what would be called a more logical pattern. Well, I must say at that time I rather supported that idea, and I still rather support the idea of museums being involved in contemporary life. And I think that they have to take positions along the line in that, but where it seemed to go awry was, again, as Hilton has pointed out correctly, there was a negation of responsibility at some moment, a negation of responsibility on the part of curators especially, and in those days, please understand, curators who were interested in maintaining some vague kind of semblance of family life became directors, because directors were the only people who were paid a salary. Curators kind of worked on piecemeal things. I hope that's one of the things that we must change, and I'll say that right now. If we are ever going to grab our institutions back, curator salaries have to be as close to director salaries as they can possibly be, because that's the only way we're going to keep people being curators and not moving on to this strange profession called museum director, which is now glorified fundraiser, is a development officer in disguise. My ex-wife, Jan Butterfield, used to say the primary requisite for being a museum director is that you look well in a tux, and I think that probably has some validity, increasing validity in this day and age. But I do think that in this arena of things going awry, as a composite, I think, number one, the idealism of the position of curator, the desire to hold that title and hold that position because of the rapid expansion of museums throughout the country, east, west, north, south, simply provided more opportunities for people to take that title and were prepared to receive it. And as a result of that, a large number of young people full of idealism and full of new art attitudes, but without restraint, began to serve in that role. And
Henry,
as those people,
at the risk of interrupting an eloquent
you are interrupting,
flow,
but please
I
go
am.
ahead. That's right.
I think
and
it's
properly
probably,
too.
I think it's
right.
probably Hilton's turn.
It is Hilton's turn. I was simply, so you all understand, I was simply picking up my 5 minutes that Hilton took extra on the podium.
All right. Thank you.
Well, I'm very happy to have Henry speak as he did, particularly about the plight of the museum curator, because for people of our generation, there were certain, well, I suppose it would be absurd to call them sainted curators, but nonetheless they were venerated. They were incredibly ill-paid. I must say they, except to their nearest and dearest, they didn't complain about it much. They had a mission. Their focus was entirely on the aesthetic value of what they wanted to bring to the museum. That is, what they wanted to bring to the museum public. And what we have seen, because of all of the developments that both Henry and I have described this evening, we are seeing the disappearance of that kind of museum curator. Actually, the museum curators are being paid somewhat better, not adequately, but somewhat better than they used to be. But the role that they perform now is no longer a role in which independent critical judgment can play the primary part in what they do. That is, the whole way the museum functions as a cultural institution is now so hemmed in by so many bureaucratic pressures. That is, how can the corporate support be established? Will the NEA or the NEH find this an appealing proposition? You have to put together such a complicated bureaucratic package to have even the least museum program approved by the board and by the director of your institution, that there's a whole realm of independent aesthetic judgment that has begun to evaporate. And the kinds of people who now serve on boards, I mean, it's a subject that probably only Balzac and Molière could do justice to. But it has a very direct bearing on the art that actually gets purchased by museums, that gets exhibited by museums. It now has a great deal to do with the kinds of personnel that museums employ. There's no reason for me to be delicate about it. We have the Whitney Museum here in New York, which now scarcely even has a curator, because the director of the museum simply hasn't the tiniest conception of what a curator is. Many years ago, when the present director had been in office for not such a terribly long time, and I had written a number of very critical articles in the New York Times about the Whitney, and he attempted through one means to deal with these articles. That is, on one occasion after one of my articles, a delivery was made to the New York Times to all the top editorial brass of the paper, and this delivery consisted of a large button that said, "Hilton who?" ? This was sent to the publisher of the New York Times, the executive editor, the managing editor, and in each case I got a call and saying, "Who is this clown running the Whitney Museum?" Well, when that didn't work, then I was invited to lunch. And
I think you have been in the trenches, Hilton.
And across the lunch table at the Century Club, where I was not then yet a member, the director said to me, well, you're writing all these terrible things about the Whitney Museum. What do we need? What do you think we need? And I said, well, you need a great curator, because delicacy prohibited me from saying you need a great director. I said, you need a great curator. And the not-so-great director said, in all innocence, really? What does a curator do? Well, he's never found out. And it's not the only game in town in which the director hasn't found out. There has been an incredible erosion of professional museum life. That is, it's an analog to what's happened in academic life, and that is, you no longer find the best minds going into it. And that's a great tragedy.
Yes, I wanted to just follow that up a bit, because is one of the problems the presence of collectors on museum boards? I've never quite understood that, because as an employee of the government, our standards of conduct would absolutely prohibit us from any kind of involvement in the questions of hiring or firing a museum director if we at the same time had, so to speak, a financial interest in the outcome of one or another kind of exhibition that might serve to elevate the value of our own collections.
You mean conflicts of interest?
Yes, I do.
Well, let me respond very quickly. Yes, it is a problem. It is a true problem, and it is absolute, and it is permeating institutions around the country, perhaps more away from New York. But the Whitney example is a good example. The National Gallery, I think, is a good example, where each of these institutions, and I now speak from a regional position, with malice when I say this, because the Whitney Museum and the National Gallery both have councils made up of people from around the country, which pay significant amounts of money. I think of the Whitney Museum, it's $5,000 to be on the drawing committee, $10,000 to be on the photography committee, and $25,000 to be on the painting committee, I think is what it is. The National Gallery in Washington, our great people's institution, has a national group of hundreds of people made up of the board members of other institutions, each of whom used to pay $5,000, maybe now $10,000 a year, for the right to come to Washington twice a year, to have a grand party, to be spoken to by Carter, to be wooed out of any objects of importance they might have to give to the National Gallery rather than San Francisco, Los Angeles, or Chicago, Detroit, Michigan, and so forth and so on. And in that process, they have the right, by paying this money, to purchase a contemporary work of art for the National Gallery. Not always the one suggested by the curator. They then in turn, and this is the point I want to make, they then in turn come back from this wonderful thing that's been given to them, this honor that's been given to them to be on the Whitney Accession Committee for Drawings or the National Gallery group, and they come back to San Francisco, Chicago, Detroit, et cetera, with this great knowledge of the importance of being part of this group of people and what they have done, and therefore what they suggest you buy is what they just bought for the National Gallery, and they don't listen to the curators. And the curators, tragically, and this unfortunately is the truth, curators increasingly are under such fire by board members of that type that to hold their positions, they simply bend in the wind, and that's where we are.
Well, I think there has been a significant change in the behavior of board members. That is, without necessarily being naive about the degree of self-interest that governs certain board members of museums in earlier time. The one guarantee I think that one could say was operative, say when Alfred Barr was directing the Museum of Modern Art, for example, was that most of the people on his board, although they were collectors of art, they were collectors of unexceptionable art. That is, they bought Impressionist paintings, or in those days they bought paintings by Ingres or Delacroix or Courbet or the Impressionists or some of the really adventurous ones bought post-Impressionist paintings. And where 20th century art was concerned, and particularly where the work of living artists was concerned, there were very, very few interested parties on the board. Those board members, for the most part, regarded the work of living artists as a terra incognita. They granted the director and his curators a kind of indulgence by buying these things. They would never dream, for the most part, of owning them themselves. Or if they did, I mean, they sort of went into the upstairs bathrooms. And there was, you know, we didn't know it at the time. I mean, those people were ridiculed as being sort of against new developments in art and so on, but it turned out to be a great safeguard, actually, because they were not, they did not stand in relation to the contemporary art scene the way, you know, touts stand in relation to horses running in a race. And that is now very much the case. Henry, though you may think he's given you a rather grim account of what actually occurs, has painted the rosiest version of it imaginable.
I wonder, in the midst of all of this, and I mean, these are very serious matters, do either of you have glimmers of hope to offer us?
Yes, I think I said that before, and I believe it to be true. I think that the difficulty at this, well, let me go back and start again. When Hilton was speaking of the board members, you were asking about the board members, I wanted to jump in at that moment and say, but please understand, from the standpoint of the board members, in large part, it is naivete, not malice. They simply do not know better.
I agree with that.
They have not been trained to be board of trustees. They don't have art education. They don't know what a nonprofit is. They simply know how to run their business, and that's all they're doing is carrying that over into the nonprofit arena. All right. So that is a factor. In my mind, if there is a being to be charged with something other than that, it would have to be the art dealers. And my own impression, and I won't be any more delicate than you were about the Whitney, my own impression is that a dozen dealers control that art market throughout the United States, and that's why all of the institutions are looking the same. That's why we're getting bored with the whole process. The hope, the glimmer of hope, of course, is to change that. And through conversations like this, making a broader public aware of the condition that indeed does exist, and to slowly return the institution. It has to be slowly, obviously, to return the institutions to the curators, better trained curators, to boards of trustees without conflict of interest or pointing out what conflict of interest is, and proceeding in a much more minimal fashion than that which we're proceeding in at the present time. Now, I'm sorry, it was going to take me 2 more minutes, okay? Because the condition of this expansive mood we've been in for 20 years, which none of us thought would last as long as that, has gotten out of hand. We are an engine running rampant around the country. Part of that's the idealism of young curators who want to do shows, because now a brilliant young curator might live in Dubuque, Iowa, because that's where he can get a job, all right? And he wants to do an exhibition of importance for New York, for Los Angeles, for other places. That I understand fully. But the key issue in this is that just like the economic marketplace, we need a dramatic settling, and the sooner it happens, the better, all right? I would prefer not to be that dramatic, but if it has to be dramatic, then a good solid punch in the nose to what's happening right now, just like the market did recently, would be the most advantageous thing to getting us on the right track again.
Thank you. Hilton.
Well, I think that I basically agree with what Henry's saying, and one of the most urgent necessities, because if the punch in the nose comes, it's not going to be of any benefit to us unless there is a group of professional museum people who have the vision to guide, the remnants of what's left after the punch into the future. The museum profession is in an extremely precarious, threatened, and I would say demoralized state. That is, there is now, for the most part, no independent intellectual life in the museum world. There are a few extremely good people who are very adept at disguising from their superiors, their boards, and even their public what they actually believe. But how long they can maintain this disguise, is a question. And if the momentum and the social developments we've described of the past decade or two continue, those people are going to perish. Whether they're the people going to emerge as the leaders after the fall, so to speak, if the fall comes, remains to be seen. But there is now no institution, there is no realm there's no realm of intellectual prestige that encourages people to display any kind of independent judgment, that encourages or rewards any kind of defiance of all of the pressures we've been describing. The museum world has become to resemble very much the academic world, where mediocrity is now the basis of advancement. And in the academic world, everybody knows that the real ideas take place outside the academy, and I think we're coming to now a period when we can say very much the same thing about the museum world.
Well, Hugh's sorting his cards. Through that, I might also say that it's conceivably possible that the NEA could play a role in this evolution, in this process. I'm not prepared to say exactly how, but it crosses my mind, for example, that it's not impossible to think the NEA may choose not to fund any exhibition which has already been funded by a corporation. That's one place to begin.
You're really talking about the millennium,
yes,
Henry.
It's not impossible for me.
Of course, Henry, I mean, it's frequently argued to us
yes.
that our having decided to support an exhibition, which I believe, because I think our panels really do try to be honest
yes,
about this, hasn't been selected for any reason that is, so to speak, extraneous. Mm-hmm. And that might indeed induce a corporation to tread a more wholesome path. So I don't know I don't know that entirely that we would gain from that.
No, again, and I do think the panels do indeed make every attempt, and in fact are as honest as anything is in American life. The second thing...
That's a very equivocal remark.
I'm not sure that I would care to testify to a congressional committee with that text.
And I think an accurate one.
All right. Now, come along. I said as accurate as anything in American life.
Yes, it's accurate.
No, I wanted to just to pursue another thing a little bit. I was struck some time ago when I was talking to a number of museum people about, so to speak, the demand for accountability of a certain kind, which I think, by the way, the public agencies, New York City, New York State, and even God Save the Mark, the National Endowment, have, so to speak, brought about, and the possibility that may introduce a requirement for the kind of popularization that you talked about. And in the course of that conversation, I said, well, I always thought that one part of the public for the American Museum of Natural History is my brother-in-law who used to live in Trinidad and who wrote a book about the birds of Trinidad and Tobago, and most of whose research was done on West 79th Street in the hidden drawers of skins of birds from Venezuela and South America. And it seems to me that museums have not done a very good job of articulating the case for that kind of user of the museum. Not only the scholar, but I mean the serious student. We're talking here about publics that museums really haven't dramatized very well.
Well, you see, museums have really abandoned their role as intellectual institutions.
But isn't that explicable? It seems to me that that's a case that could be made.
Mm-hmm. Another point, let's raise another one. I think that another thing that NEA could consider, for example, the museum catalog, the museum catalog book, the museum picture library, I don't know, whatever, the coffee table phenomenon, whatever you want to call it. The fact that institutions, and again, this is one of those terrible things, institutions now reproduce in color everything that's in the exhibition because the lenders won't lend unless, in fact, their work is reproduced in color. First of all, reproduced, then reproduced in color. So every museum publication has become in excess of 100 to 150 pages and has given up content entirely to the reproductions. And it seems to me that some more effort on the part of state and national agencies to ensure content in museum catalogs may have some bearing.
Okay. I'm going to move on to some of the questions. We have a lot of questions, and I haven't by any means sorted through all of them, and so I will present perhaps one or two of them to you while I deal the rest of the pack. First of all, is it better, in either of your opinion, to have Walter Cronkite's audio observations in a museum, or do we keep the art illiterate out of the temple?
Well, I don't think those are the choices. That is, what that question is really saying, do we keep people out, or do we bring them in and tell them lies? Now, neither of those, I mean, those alternatives don't describe the real world. That is, people come to museums, and we're talking about people who come to the museums, say, for the first or second or third time, for a variety of reasons. They're either curious, it's an accident, a friend or a family member brings them. I mean, you know, they come to museums for all kinds of odd reasons the first time. The people who tend to make a habit of going to museums go because art comes to occupy a place in their lives for reasons that most people would find very difficult to, I think, articulate. But the kind of person who is going to come to the museum solely on the basis of a Walter Cronkite tape is never going to come back unless it's, you know, who? I don't see any of those news programs, so I don't know who the other anchor people are now. But, you know, that terrible Barbara, what's her name?
They're not Walter Cronkite.
But, I mean, if they come back, you know, for another ghastly tape, I mean, what does it advance either in their lives, in our lives, the life of the museum, the life of art? It's a fraud.
Yes, I find it rather interesting to contemplate the Woody Allen tape, so to speak.
It will come, I guarantee it.
And unfortunately, it will probably be very good.
Henry, this may be a little bit more in your direction. If all the museums are indeed filled to capacity, and if the Museum of Modern Art should concentrate on just showing its permanent collection, does that mean that the existing museums should stop acquiring new works? Does this also mean that the new generations will need brand new museums?
Well, okay, that's a long and involved question, and the answers are multiple. I would have to say, in the case of the Museum of Modern Art, if I could have the Museum of Modern Art do what I would like it to do, it would quit acquiring works of art. It would reduce its staff to a reasonable number. It would do exhibitions around that brilliant collection. It would be the Museum of Modern Art, and it would be a wonderful institution. The fear of that on the part, I'm sure, of Richard Oldenburg and the trustees of the Museum of Modern Art is that nobody would come. And as a result of that, they feel they can't exist under that kind of an environment. And I don't think that's giving up anything. I just think that would be a wonderful solution. The second portion of the question, do new artists demand new museums? That seems to me an inevitability, that is the way we're going to proceed. And one of the reasons I like working on the West Coast than the East Coast is that we have more territory. And I've said on a number of occasions that what probably will happen in California is this thing not unlike Father Sarah, who planted missions, as you may know, on a day's horseback ride apart up the coast of California. Well, I can see art institutions, they're already there. La Jolla, San Diego, Newport Beach, Laguna Beach, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, so forth and so on. So you can have kind of an art fix at breakfast, lunch, and dinner as you go up the coast. And that's possible for us in California, and I don't find that a bother, but I think that they should be small, manageable institutions and not the behemoths that we've created. Okay.
Thank you. Has art criticism any responsibility for the current situation?
Well, I think art criticism has a great deal of responsibility, at least to question, criticize, and condemn a great deal of what the situation is. The trouble is there's so very little art criticism that does that. That is, what we have seen in the last 20 or so years is the emergence of a new kind of writer whom the world agrees to still call critics, but who are sort of pens for hire, and who, one week do a museum catalog, another week do a gallery catalog, another week do 30 articles in Art in America, but it's all part of the market. They have very fast word processors, but judgment, distinctions, critical distinctions are not part of what they do. I mean, some of these people have PhDs, they're, in my opinion, among the worst, but it has nothing to do with a critical function. That is, art criticism has really fallen on evil days. There were never great many wonderful critics, but alas, there were once more than there are today. Most of them today are whores.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think I will demur in this instance. Thank you very much.
How does our museum bureaucracy compare with European museums in other parts of the world?
Well, at dinner, Hilton and I were talking about a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours, Pontus Hilton, who was and is again the director of the Pompidou Center, who ran brilliantly, we thought, in America, the Stockholm Museum prior to that time. I've since reasoned out the reason we thought he was so brilliant is that he showed nothing but American art during his tenure. But that's but nonetheless an important person in the museum field. And he came from the Pompidou Museum to direct MoCA, the new Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. And everyone was very enthusiastic and very excited about his coming, as was I. But many of us tried to speak to the Board of Trustees of MoCA, a new group of entrepreneurial types in rather large numbers, to explain to them that Mr. Hilton had never been the director of an American art museum, and for that reason had never attended a board meeting, and for that reason had never but once a year gone before a government body to request his annual budget, and assuming he didn't do something totally inane, he would go back the next year and ask for a somewhat larger budget and would proceed with it. And the spending of that funding was between the director of the museum and the curators and the other department people who were there. Well, this is changing somewhat in Europe because while they've been totally state and government funded in the past. They are looking for ways to get to the corporate communities as well. So we'll see some shifts in that. But the difference between a museum professional, director and or curator in Europe and a museum professional in the United States is profound and dramatic.
Well, I think in the past, certainly, there's been a tremendous difference between European museums and American museums because virtually all European museums were government institutions. But there really is a tremendous change taking place now. I mean, the fact that the Gauguin exhibition I mentioned, that the French National Museums are collaborating on with the National Gallery and the Art Institute of Chicago is being very largely funded by AT&T. That's not an exhibition on that scale that the French National Museums would have undertaken out of the National Treasury. I mean, they just would never have dreamed of doing it. It's all become, just frightfully expensive. And more, you see it in England, you see it in other parts of Europe, more and more there is this tendency to get corporations or other patrons to subsidize government money. The one thing that European museums have so far, at least as far as I know, held out against is that no European museum is allowed actually to de-accession anything out of the collection because it's government property. And you can actually go to jail for selling government property. But I have the feeling that one of these awful days that will come too. No, I think in this respect, as in many others, we represent a model that the Europeans are going to be only too eager to follow.
I think that is prophetic, yes. I was in Austria at the beginning of October at a meeting which I had very mixed feelings about attending because it was an attempt to establish a business committee for the arts in Austria. And that's undoubtedly going to have a tremendous impact on the kind of activities that take place in institutions that have been, at least from certain points of view, extremely independent. The other side of that, of course, is that in the major historical museum in Vienna, when it snows, there is actually rain coming down in the room with the jurors, so it's a mixed picture. But this is the wave of the future, I'm sure, there also. I have to rephrase this question a little bit, and I hope the questioner will forgive me. How would you intend to educate the masses in terms of art if we are to be democratic without the blockbuster exhibitions? Or alternatively, do art museums have to be elitist?
Well, again, let me speak a little bit to that point. Beginning with the Bill Seitz example of the responsive eye and moving forward from that, when museum exhibitions came closer to the line, when there were more American artists producing art, when we were totally seduced into believing that American art was the only art in the world, and we showed it over and over and over again. And in the 60s, when the artists revolted, 60s and 70s, when the artists revolted and said enough of Clement Greenberg, enough of Hilton Kramer, enough of this, enough of that, let's get down and mix it up, at the democratic level. American museums took a dramatic step in that direction and could have overdone it, didn't necessarily overdo it, but it certainly reduced the common denominator to a much lower level than it existed prior to that time, in my estimation. Now, I'm not going to say is that good or is that bad. It's been my feeling, it was my feeling then, as is my feeling now, that you have to reach a certain level before you bounce from that level, all right? And I happen to think that democratization did reframe our eyes in rather exciting ways, if not necessarily in terms of art women were producing as opposed to men, but it certainly reframed my eyes in terms of Central American, South American art, for example, some Asian art, a variety of things that my gringo eyes simply had not seen because they weren't trained to see that as art in the past. So those are salutary, I think, as it went along. How do we now in the future develop audience without the blockbuster exhibition? I think through the multiplicity of opportunity. And one of the things we tried to do in San Francisco was to be, if nothing else, diverse. And by that I mean dealing with photography, with design, with some things that Hilton might not care for in the general process of semi-elitism, trying to hit a number of different audiences so they each felt that as a home, as a place where they could go for whatever reason. I think that's the ultimate expansion, is to give intelligent opportunities for people to respond to things that they have some knowledge of and appreciate.
Wilson?
Well, I sort of approach that question somewhat differently, and that is that, first of all, I don't think there are any masses. That is, there are a lot of different kinds of people in the world who have who are educated in different ways. And by the way, it's not always the most educated who are the most responsive to works of art. I would say that people with PhDs have to prove themselves to be responsive to works of art. One cannot take for granted that they are. I mean, I don't think there are any masses. At the same time, I don't much care for the term elitism or elitist because it suggests a certain kind of denigration or at least segregation of the kind of people who know what they're looking at. And I don't think that it's a bad thing for museums to cater to a public that's knowledgeable. As soon as they lose that public, then they're going to perish. They can't do without it. Now, how then do museums attract those people who are not knowledgeable? Well, I was once among them. I mean, I was 14 or 15, and I was in that condition for quite some years after that. Nobody ever induced me to go to the museum. I went after I first discovered it, I went because I liked it. And I don't think that artificially induced appeals ever work. That is, the blockbuster exhibition, which is defended in this particular argument as building the museum public, does not build the museum public. And every museum professional knows that it doesn't, even though we won't admit it. That is, the only audience that the museum blockbuster builds is the audience for future museum blockbusters. The audience for the blockbuster exhibition does not come back to savor the beautiful objects in the permanent collection of the museum. I mean, it just doesn't happen. And just as the audience for the Walter Cronkite tape is only going to come back the next tape by Barbara, what's her name? I mean, that's really I mean, that's a false promise. The way you build an audience for an art museum or for art is the way you build an audience for any artistic experience, slowly, by very modest increments. And as soon as you try to rush it, as soon as you try to somehow accelerate it, you're going to create an artificial audience, that you're going to become a servant of. And the only way you can build a serious audience is by those very slow increments, taking them one step at a time and making it very clear at every step of the way that this is something difficult, that it's not a popsicle, and that it's not necessarily fun. And without that, it's all hopeless.
I would just add one little proviso to that. Because of the enlarged audience, the enlarged awareness, the enlarged discussion of art at a broad popular level, it has stimulated, I think, at least in California, a certain greater responsibility or perhaps just simply interest on the part of high school, junior high school, public school teachers, private school teachers. And I remember so vividly how hard we tried in the 60s and 70s to bring, in San Francisco, black audiences to the museum, to bring Asian audiences to the museum. Well, they simply didn't come. We manufactured a thing, they didn't come, they came once, that was the end of it. But now, 10 years later, the black kids and the Asian kids now in their teens and their 20s and 30s are in the museum in numbers equal to the white kids. They're coming not because we brought them there or taught them there, but because they went through, if not a painful process, at least some process through their education that made it desirable to come to an art museum as it would be to go to a symphony or something else. And I think that is spreading throughout our culture, and I think that's fantastic.
Yes, I think that's a point worth making, because I think that even if you, so to speak, shear off from all of our statistics, attendance at blockbuster exhibitions and the like, since the Second World War, the rate of public participation in attendance at museums and other artistic events has increased tremendously. And we're not looking here at we're looking at some excesses, to be sure, but also at I think a rather steady increase in public curiosity about what lies within those walls. Which I guess leads me into this question also. Would you care to elaborate on the correlation between the loss of standards in museums and in the universities? And I'm not entirely sure what the last sentence means. Is it also reflected in the aesthetic standards of the National Endowment for the Arts? In other words, have we lost it too?
Well, the study of art in the universities has undergone a drastic transformation in the last 20 years. What we've seen, to describe the development most broadly, is the abandonment of the study of art as a study of art in terms of connoisseurship, that is, of learning to know what it is you're looking at and to make distinctions between the quality of one object and another. And the substitution of art history as a social science, that is, the study of historical currents, of history of patronage, of markets, and so on. Most dramatically, this development has taken place most dramatically at the Harvard Art History faculty, which had once been the principal department that produced connoisseurs who became great museum curators and great museum directors, and which in the 70s and 80s succumbed to a sort of neo-Marxist social science view of art history, which had nothing to do with connoisseurship. So you produce scholars who know everything about the history of art except how to look at a painting. Now, many of those people serve on endowment panels, I believe, or at least NEH panels, if not NEA panels. And they tend to perpetuate their own values and standards, as we all normally do. And those standards tend to find their way into the museums, because to produce a museum catalog today, you have to have, at least most institutions feel they have to have, the support of a grant from the NEH or the NEA. And you know, and then the lecture program and so on. And recently in the Abstract Expressionist exhibition at the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo, we had a perfect example of this kind of tandem relationship, or three-way relationship between the museum, the endowments, and the academy, where this incredible catalog was produced, in which, to which a great many academics contributed. And with the exception of one entry, that is the interview with Lawrence Alloway, who was a kind of throwback to the period when people actually looked at paintings before they wrote about them. The other contributions to the catalog were all sociology. And I had the honor of being invited to come and give a lecture on that at the time of that exhibition, and it was extremely embarrassing, because I was asked to lecture on the criticism of abstract expressionist painting then and now. And the most egregious example of now was the exhibition catalog. And as my parents had brought me up to always be very respectful to my hosts, I had more or less to ask permission, to ask leave of the museum to deal with the catalog. And once given, I must say they were very gracious about it, though. It had certain awkwardnesses. And then I just happened to notice that the lecture that was following mine in the series was the lecture that was going to be given, I think, by some young art historian from Yale. And I believe the title of the lecture was Gender Problems in Abstract Expressionism. Now, you cannot have a more perfect example of the whole shift from art history as connoisseurship to art history as social science. That is, in a sense, there were no gender problems in abstract expressionism because there were no women involved in it. I mean, you know, it was, for the most part, a segregated activity. So it's as you might say, no matter what your feminist views are, it's an unprofitable subject. And yet, presumably, an audience came and sat for an entire evening and listened to a lecture on the subject. Now, under the sponsorship of an art museum, the question is, what was the responsibility of the art museum? What does the art museum represent? The art museum represents art. And what was the responsibility of the art museum there? It was not to instruct the audience in gender problems, but that's where we are.
I would only add that Lee Pollock would be down on you, Hilton.
Oh yes, she was in the exhibition, and I don't regard, you know, artists who have been undervalued as necessarily being gender problems. I mean, there were, after all, she was in the exhibition, and there were male artists left out.
I think we have time for one more question, and I would ask you both, how do you propose that museums organize special exhibitions without corporate support in this area of decreased federal funding, although that isn't entirely true, and at least the threat of the loss of individual support?
Well, it's a tough question, and I think that my response would be, again, realistic. I am amazed, and I mean that seriously, I'm amazed that the exhibition programs in museums have gone on as long as they have and have consumed the amounts of money that they have, over the past 20 years. I can remember predicting 15 years ago this has to end. It just simply has to come to a final point. I would, if this is the last question, I would like to make 2 points. One, museums in America must do a much more dramatic job of collection sharing than they have ever done in the past. This nonsense that these works of art belong to a single institution is as specious as the fact that these works of art belong to an individual, and I think that simply is wrong. We have to work toward changing that. When I was director in San Francisco, at a moment of delirium, I was seriously going to come to New York and sit down with Richard Oldenburg and propose that the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art become the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, literally, physically tied by a board to the board of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which would provide them the opportunity to eliminate some of those wonderful things from their collection, show them on the West Coast, give them a little more exhibition space, and in turn bring my entrepreneurial board to help them balance the budget. In the context of that, while it was a fantasy, it has some validity to think about in terms of, can an institution as worthy as the Museum of Modern Art have branch institutions, not even in New York, as opposed to going to the West Side or something else. That's one factor. The second factor, I think, in that arena has to do with the fact that institutions, museums, have to, as museums, stand more closely together in creating this new idea. And whether it's something as binding, let's say, as saying that no exhibition that we produced over the next number of years will have a catalog of more than 150 pages and will show no more than 60 objects, I don't know. But some things like that seem to me now not only necessary, but really quite desirable. I find it appalling to go to exhibitions and find this endless array of material that is there, unless I'm going to go for a scholarly reason and to study. But now I'm talking about the general public going to museums. I think that any great artist can get across their idea in 50 to 60 works of quality, and it might in fact help all exhibitions. So that's what I would like to see.
Thank you.
Well, it's impossible to predict what would happen if all the major art museums declared, say, a 5-year moratorium on temporary exhibitions. But it would be awfully interesting to see what the consequences would be. It would save immense quantities of money, obviously. It would be a salutary test of how interested the museum public is in art, because after all, our museums are filled with great art. But the relationship between museum attendance and temporary, or what I prefer to think of as media events, is a well-known phenomenon in the museum world. It would, I think, also inspire perhaps a certain kind of initiative and ingenuity on the part of museum staffs, alas, probably not the best kind of ingenuity, to see what they would do with the public once they did not have, a Gauguin retrospective or a Frank Steller or whatever. It would also be a marvelous new discipline for the media, because the people who concern themselves with art for the media might actually have to pay attention to the art that's there rather than the art that's newly arrived. I think it would really be wonderful for the art public to be given a kind of furlough from this incessant program of temporary events, and actually be encouraged or obliged to really go to museums and look at objects and look at them again and again and again, because anybody who has any real experience of art knows that that's the only way you ever get to know anything in art, is by an accretion of experience. And it's in the nature of temporary exhibitions that you're prohibited from doing that. The whole momentum of temporary exhibitions induces a superficiality of aesthetic experience, which my dreamed of, alas never to be realized, moratorium or furlough would, I think, contribute much to correcting, but it's a utopian idea.
I don't want to have the last word, but I will say one thing, and then you can think and say one more thing, if you would, Hilton. But it is something that I feel absolutely obliged to get into every lecture or symposium or panel that I sit upon. And that, to me, is one of the most ridiculous and remarkable things in the American museum world, that every museum in the country, except our National Gallery, charges a fee for admission. And when I go to the National Gallery with my boards of trustees, they walk in the front door free and say, "Isn't this a wonderful gift we're being given by this great institution?" Not realizing, of course, that their tax dollars and everything else are keeping it open. I would propose, and have proposed many times, that the National Gallery of Art charge admission. But they set aside that admission fee, which would be millions of dollars, to establish a fund to be doled out, perhaps through the National Endowment of the Arts, to young curators for original works of scholarship in American museums. I think it would be a great benefit to us all.
Wilson, do you have a...
No, I'm perfectly happy to have Henry get the last word. After all, he's the veteran of the trenches.
Before I formally close this, I am asked to remind you of the final evening of this series of talks about the future of various areas of art in America. On Tuesday, January 19th, Hortense Kalischer and James Atlas will be discussing the future of the novel, and I will have the pleasant task of moderating that discussion also. And with that, thank you both. I think that was very lively.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.